Hey everyone, it's Lori, and I'm here today with my October reading wrap up. In the month of October, I finished 7 books. I finished 4 audiobooks and 3 physical books, and I didn't read any Kindle books this month. So I'm just going to go ahead and get started with the sci-fi fantasy, then I'm going to move to fiction, and then finally the nonfiction book I read this month. So, in sci-fi and fantasy, the first book I listened to was Station 11 by Emily St. John Mandel. This is something that my husband has been suggesting to me for a very long time, and I think I had been on a wait list at the library for a audio copy of this book, so I decided to go ahead and listen to it, and I will admit that it was not what I expected. I didn't go into it knowing a lot about it, which is okay by me, but I guess from the title Station 11 and the cover, I assumed it would take place in space on a, spaceship or something along those lines, like a space station sort of situation. But it doesn't. It takes place on Earth, and it starts with like a flu pandemic, so that was super fun to read right now. But I really, really enjoyed this book. The thing that's interesting about it is that it jumps around a lot between times, and so I think that this one might be easier to read in a physical book form than listen to an audiobook, because every once in a while you get a little confused as to where you were in the storyline. And then it's got quite a few different characters that you're just waiting for them to kind of converge. But I thought it was extremely well written, and I enjoyed it very much, and I rated it very highly. It was probably tied for my favorite book in the month of October. The next sci-fi fantasy book that I read was Warrior of Altai by Robert Jordan. So this is the first book that Robert Jordan wrote. He attempted to publish it, and it never got published, and so his widow has published it in the last couple years, probably 2 years ago or so. Not really sure exactly when it came out. And it was interesting. I won't say it was among my favorite books, but I did enjoy kind of seeing early writings by Robert Jordan. You could see a lot of the same themes and maybe some of the inspirations for the Wheel of Time series. So there was a lot of like cultural world building, and it had a very interesting premise where like people kind of got put in this situation through coming through some sort of I don't know quite what to call it, but like a wormhole or something that got them from a different world to this world. So one of the characters is kind of a more modern person. She's a student that ends up kind of back in time. The interesting part at the beginning of this that I really enjoyed was the introduction that was written by Harriet McDougall, who is Robert Jordan's widow. And you got it in this introduction. It was very fun to find out how they met and how things started, because she was in the publishing business and she was looking for basically somebody to write the next big bodice ripper, because that's what was selling at the time. And apparently Robert Jordan told her, "Oh yes, I could do that." And it sounds like his idea was fairly traumatic, and not a good idea. But I enjoyed the introduction probably more than the book, and I'm not saying I didn't enjoy the book, but the highlight for me was that introduction and learning a little bit about the relationship between Robert Jordan and his wife. That's kind of how they met, was with him trying to sell this particular novel. So it was a fun one to read. I feel like there could have been a lot more. It could have been like a series like Wheel of Time, but I'm kind of glad that there isn't, because it kind of would have been a little overwhelming to continue the storyline, I think. And the third science fiction and fantasy book that I listened to this month was Axioms End by Lindsay Ellis. This is one of the books that I was considering when I did my reading books by YouTubers that I follow video. And so I had gotten on the wait list. I had suggested to the library that they purchase it, and I got on the wait list for it. And it did come available, and I thought, well, I think I would enjoy reading this. And this is a very interesting story that involves kind of a 20 something woman living at home with her mother. Her father is like this big whistleblower type person, and so the narration in the book had one female narrator narrating most of the book, but these little snippets from news stories about her father or that sort of thing, like taking you outside of the story to kind of the world itself, were narrated by a man. So that was kind of an interesting way of doing that. She is involved in like first contact and kind of becomes a translator for the alien that has come to Earth. And I really enjoyed this book. I thought it was really well done. I'm looking forward to the next books in this series because I do believe this is supposed to be a multi-book series. The character, I feel like Lindsay Ellis wrote a bit of herself into that character. And it's always interesting to see that because that probably happens with a lot of authors, but because I'm not watching them regularly, you don't really see it as much as you do when you're reading a book by a YouTuber because you know their personality to some extent and the face they show to the world. So it was very interesting to see some of the characteristics that I associate with Lindsay Ellis from her YouTube channel in her main character, her protagonist. So I don't want to give too much away, but there's a lot of very interesting thoughts on first contact and intelligent life and that sort of thing within the book. Moving into the fiction books that I read this month, I started with The Inimitable Jeeves by P.G. Wodehouse. This is the second of the Jeeves books. I don't necessarily read these in order, but I do think that maybe the last one I read was technically the first. Maybe not. It's really hard to keep track. No, it wasn't. The last one I read was like 7th or 8th, but I think that I had already read the first one, so when I went into the library app to see if there were any P.G. Wodehouse books available, and the second one was available, I figured I'd go with that one. So this was yet another funny Jeeves book. Okay, and in this particular Jeeves novel, Bertie's friend Bingo Little keeps falling in love with different women, and so it's left to Bertie and Jeeves to try to help him out and maybe make things work out because his uncle, who is Bingo's uncle, who is also the person kind of providing him with money for a living, is not pro any of Bingo's love interests. So the first one happens to be a waitress, and this would be marrying way below his station. And so Bingo comes up with this plan where he convinces his uncle. Well, Jeeves comes up with a plan. Okay, Jeeves's plan is to have the uncle read these books by this author that are about like the wealthy marrying the working class and that love must prevail kind of things. So Bingo gets his uncle to read these books, and then Bingo decides to convince his uncle that Bertie is actually the author of the books, and so ends up blowing up in Bertie's face later on in the book, but it's pretty hilarious. But Bingo, I don't know, goes through 4 different true loves that he must marry right away in this book, so it was pretty funny. I enjoyed it. I always enjoy P.G. Wodehouse, and I always enjoy Jeeves, so I figured this would just be a fun, quick thing to listen to. They're not super long books, and it just kept me entertained for a couple of days. The next fiction book I read was actually a mystery novel by Josephine Tey. It's called A Shilling for Candles, and this is the second of Josephine Tey's books. I read the first one, The Man in the Queue, last month or the month before, but my favorite Josephine Tey book is The Daughter of Time. And so I think that's like 7 or 8. But I just decided, because I enjoy her books so much, that I would go back and kind of read or listen to her other books that she had written. Shilling for Candles was a fun one. These are older books, and so there were some fairly problematic things about Jewish people and that sort of thing in the book. It did not appear to be the author's perspective, but just her taking characters from this period of time in which, like, kind of an anti-Judaism feeling was in Britain, and kind of bringing that to the forefront. So there were a few times that it was a little uncomfortable to a modern ear, but overall, I really did enjoy this book. It's always interesting to see how these end, because they don't end the way they kind of seem to be leading towards most of the time. So this one was interesting. This one is about the death of a film actress, mysterious death by drowning, trying to figure out who had killed her. And like the only clue they have is a coat button tangled in her hair. So another good book by Josephine Tey. And then the last fiction book that I read in October was Home by Marilynne Robinson. This was the close reads book for, I believe, part of September or most of September and October. And I kind of waited until towards the end of all of the podcasts to actually get started with this. I actually started it back in September. I had a really hard time getting through the first 50 pages. I don't really have a good reason why. It was just kind of a slow starter for me. This is a book in a series, and this is not the first book in the series. So that might have been a little bit of why it was a slow starter for me. But as I got into it, I came to really, really love the character of Glory, who is kind of the narrator of this book in a sense. So we see everything from Glory's perspective. Her father is an elderly preacher in his last days. And in this book, the black sheep of the family, her brother Jack, comes home to kind of see his father one last time. And they're trying to repair a relationship, and it's very difficult. So it's not the sort of book where a lot happens. It's just they're at home, but it brings up a lot of things from the past and talks about those things. So I found this very interesting. I really appreciated the Close Reads podcasts on this, because they, earlier in the year when we were reading The End of the Affair by Graham Greene, that's one of like the great Catholic novels. And I have a lot more experience, since I am a convert to Catholicism, with Catholic novels than with kind of Protestant novels. And they said if there was a classic, like the Protestant novel, the Great American Protestant novel, they said it would be Gilead, which was the first book in this series. So it really helped me a lot to hear some Protestant views on what's going on in these books, because they are Calvinist, so they believe in predestination, and that's not something I really understand wholeheartedly. So having that discussion for background for these books was very helpful to me. And then the final book that I read in the month of October was a nonfiction book, and that was Race for Profit: How Banks and the Real Estate Industry Undermined Black Homeownership. And this is by Keeanga Yamada Taylor. And this book was amazing. This is tied as for my favorite book of the month. I really enjoyed Station 11, and I really enjoyed Race for Profit. It wasn't exactly an easy read, because it was a fairly academic look at the history of the real estate and lending process, and all of the different federal laws and regulations that were put into place, and whether or not they worked the way they said they were supposed to, or didn't quite work that way. You know, like things like HUD, and different mortgage lending programs, And there was so much in here. Like, I do have an understanding of redlining and things like that, but there was so much in this book that I had never heard before. I did not know that at one point the idea was to get women on welfare to buy homes, and which in theory is not a bad idea, but the practical application of this was that realtors and mortgage lenders and that sort of thing would get women who had very little choice for housing. Maybe they could no longer stay in the projects that they were in, or whatever the situation may be. They would get them to buy a house with just the most cursory glance at it, and sometimes these houses didn't have a furnace or didn't have running water, and then they blamed the homeowners when the homeowners couldn't keep up the repairs on houses. And sometimes houses that had basically been condemned were just bought up, and like a few cosmetic things were fixed and then sold at a huge profit to these mothers, usually single mothers on welfare, black single mothers on welfare. It's just frightening, all of the just terrible things that were happening in the real estate industry and through the federal government during the time period kind of covered by this. Yeah, it's kind of amazing just how much corruption there was and how little people actually cared about the people that they were trying to get into these houses. And there were some success stories as well of like cities that did a much better job at things where maybe they guaranteed that they'd pay repairs on the house, or they had special programs teaching the homeowners how to do repairs before they could buy the house, which helped somewhat at least. But it was a disheartening book, but it was so well written and so well researched that I would highly recommend if you're interested in social injustice and institutional racism. I do think that Race for Profit would be a great book to add to your pile of books on that subject. So that is all of the books that I read in the month of October. Please let me know down in the comments if you've read some of these books, what you thought, or if you have recommendations for me based on what I have talked about here. I'd love to hear from you. Feel free to like and subscribe. That always helps. And other than that, I will see you in the next video. Thanks. Bye.